Your brain is one of the most protected organs in your body, and that's a good thing. It's the control center for everything we do. But what happens when protection becomes a potential barrier to treatment? To fully answer this question, we need to go back. All the way back to the late 1800s, inside the lab of a German scientist named Paul Ehrlich. At the time, Ehrlich was injecting dyes into animals to test if he could find a dye that could stain and destroy pathogens, like parasites or bacteria and disease-causing microbes, without harming the animals. But when he did, the dye stained every organ except the spine, and today's focus, the brain. It was as if the dye had hit an invisible wall. That invisible wall is actually what's called the blood-brain barrier, a microscopic fortress of cells that protects our most vital organ from harm. But it also can be one of medicine's biggest obstacles. So, how do you treat the brain if you can't reach it? Hi, I'm Keira Dineen. Welcome to the Persistence Lab, where we pull back the curtain on the grit, the setbacks, and the breakthroughs driving healthcare innovation. Today, we're attempting the impossible, entering the brain's most protected fortress, the blood-brain barrier. And the first step to doing that is understanding what the blood-brain barrier is and why it's so difficult to navigate.
The blood-brain barrier is something that protects our most vital organ, our brain.
That's Dr. Blaine Stein, Vice President of Discovery Research Biotherapeutics at AbbVie.
There are lots of things that we need to keep out of the brain that we really don't want, such as bacteria or something that can infect or something that could harm our brain. But it also has to transport things in, such as nutrients. And so this barrier is almost more of a border in some regards because it negotiates what's allowed in. Oftentimes to get across a border, you're going to need a passport. And so what we figured out is that for transporting iron into the brain as a nutrient, it carries a passport along with it. And this is through the transferrin receptor. So what we've been able to do is use that passport now on antibodies and other medicines to get it across the border into the brain. And so it really is functioning as a passport that is allowing the brain to say, okay, this is okay, you're allowed to get across. And it does so much more efficiently than without that passport.
Navigating this barrier represents a significant challenge for researchers who are developing potential therapies to help treat conditions of the brain. For Dr. Nadine Rooderish, a principal research scientist at AbbVie, it's a challenge that defines her work.
You can have the best functional entity, but if you cannot get those modalities transported or enter the brain, you are limited in the extent that you can benefit those patients. We are trying to improve those capabilities that we can get those great modalities that we are developing at AbbVie inside of the brain.
So, how do scientists even begin to approach creating medicines that could cross the blood-brain barrier?
It is trial and error a lot of times. So for small molecules such as aspirin, you try and see, well, how much actually gets across, and you try and use chemistry to improve how much gets across. So you get a certain percentage across. And then for protein-based drugs, like what I work on, only about 0.1 to 0.3% of a medicine, of a protein-based drug that you give via a syringe or an infusion actually gets to the brain.
Normal antibodies, they cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. They can cross into the brain over parts of the brain where there is no blood-brain barrier.
I didn't know that part of the brain actually isn't protected or obstructed by the blood-brain barrier. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, there's still a lot of things that we try to understand as a scientific community about how all of these different aspects play together. But it's very limited, the access. Basically, what that means is you need to dose a lot of antibody. You need a lot of antibody to even reach levels that even have efficacy in the brain.
So it's a very, very low percentage. And so you have to take that into account, which means you're giving an individual a lot of medicine that actually never is getting to where it needs to be. You can give a large amount of a protein-based drug and get that fraction of a percent across the blood-brain barrier, and then it's able to get to work. But what we've seen for some of these, in particular with medicines for Alzheimer's disease, is sometimes the side effects go up also. You're always looking at risk versus benefit. And if you have to give so much drug and you're actually getting more and more side effects, then that equation, that balance of risk benefit goes more towards the risk side. So what we're trying to do is maximize the benefit side. And we know if we can get more into the brain and minimize some of the risk profile, we're going to have a better medicine.
So we know the blood-brain barrier is tough to navigate, but it's not impenetrable. There's some molecules that pass through this barrier successfully. One example can be found in the first thing most of us reach for in the morning.
I have my cup of coffee.
Yes, as do I.
And the caffeine in that coffee, it gets across the blood-brain barrier. So that is an example. But there's so many things that don't. And these, for the majority of medicines that we develop, a lot of them don't get across the blood-brain barrier as effectively as something like caffeine.
Getting medicine into the brain has never been simple, but for a long time, it's been defined by frustration and a lot of trial and error. But the example of caffeine provides a clue that maybe the answer isn't in breaking the barrier, but working with it.
There's so many approaches that we use to treat different disease. And we have what we call modalities. And so you could have a small molecule would be one modality. You could have a biologic, that would be another modality. But now we're starting to see breakthroughs in genetics medicine and other modalities. So as an industry broadly, a lot of people are looking at these shuttle-based approaches and try and improve the therapeutic efficacy to help patients in areas that in the past there's just been too big of a barrier to get to that part of the brain you need to get to.
Shuttle technology really is another word for delivery. It's like we use the term shuttle just to visualize the delivery aspect of getting a modality inside of the brain. What we do is we add shuttle modality. And the sole purpose of that modality really is to get the therapeutic modality shuttled over the blood-brain barrier or transported over the blood-brain barrier into the brain, where then the therapeutic modality can interact with what we envision would treat the disease. The early pioneers, they called this principle the Trojan horse, and I think that is actually a very good way to describe it. The Trojan horse is a term that was taken from Greek mythology. If you know the story, it's that the Greeks were trying to enter the city of Troy or like take over the city of Troy. And they really had a hard time doing so because Troy had a city wall that was very advanced for the times and basically nobody could enter. They were basically building that horse and put in the Greek army. The Trojans thought that this was a gift because they didn't see any Greeks anymore. So they took the Trojan horse inside of the walls of Troy. And that is how the Greek army was taking over Troy. And the analogy here with going back to the shuttle principle is the therapeutic moiety in this analogy would be the Greek army could not enter the brain. In that analogy, the blood-brain barrier would be the walls of Troy. But because of the shuttle modality that is attached to the therapeutic modality, the Trojan horse, the Greeks, aka the therapeutic modality, can enter the brain.
That Trojan horse analogy is spot on because it's about finding ways to cloak molecules so they can slip through the blood-brain barrier. But what I'm wondering with this is, does the size or type of molecule that we're cloaking matter? So can shuttle technology be used to transport any molecule?
The size of the molecule can be a big impediment. And so in my area, what we develop for biologics, it's essentially the size of a jet airplane versus a bicycle for a small molecule. And it's really hard to get that jet airplane across the blood-brain barrier. And that's where we really have to leverage these transport mechanisms. Like I said earlier, the transferrin receptor. But there are other receptors too we're learning about that can also transport biologics or small molecules or other things across this blood-brain barrier. And so we also need to do more research in this area to really understand, okay, what are the other receptors that exist on this blood-brain barrier that we can use to maybe get to a different part of the brain or to different cells within the brain? And so we're looking at a variety of different shuttle mechanisms beyond transferrin that we think for certain applications, they're going to have a lot of benefit.
The progress that's been made in brain science hasn't been quick by any means. Each step has required years of development, a deep understanding of the biology of the brain, and constant iteration. But researchers stick with it because the potential impact could reshape how we treat neurological diseases, and more importantly, how we can help the people affected by these conditions.
All the diseases that would affect the brain, if we would manage to find a solution for the delivery problem, I think it would open up this whole area of possibilities, really.
So when we see these opportunities, these breakthroughs with regard to delivery to the brain, we're thinking very broadly about, okay, there's a lot we could be doing here. Abby's very committed to. What is the opportunity in these specific ones? So in neurodegeneration, yes, Alzheimer's is incredibly important, but there are many others too. So if you think about Parkinson's and ALS, these are very debilitating disorders. And if we have an opportunity to get a medicine to treat these to the brain and do it more effectively, we're definitely going to be pursuing that.
There could also be neurodevelopmental examples, or neuropsychiatric disorders could also be examples that all have the issue that great medications or great treatments exist, but if they cannot reach the brain in sufficient amounts, there will be a limitation in the efficacy those treatments can reach. Another example would be neuroblastomas. A very commonly known one would be glioblastoma, which unfortunately currently has a very low survival rate because of the limitations of access of the treatments. So if there would be a way to cross the blood-brain barrier, right, like that would be a huge impact for that patient population.
Let's pause on this for a second. The scope and impact of all the neurological conditions that Dr. Stein and Dr. Ruderich just mentioned are huge. In 2021, 3.4 billion people, that's 43% of the population on Earth, were affected by neurological conditions. In the US, about 1 in 9 people will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and that comes with a host of economic, mental, and emotional challenges. Less than 30% of adults diagnosed with glioblastoma, an aggressive form of brain cancer, are expected to live more than 5 years, and that number drops to only about 6% for patients over the age of 40. This shows just how important the work is for scientists who are committed to finding ways to deliver medicines to the brain. But the complexity of these conditions also makes research that much more challenging, which is why the scientific community is making a more concerted effort to learn from one another. And these interdisciplinary learnings are helping scientists tackle these challenges in new and innovative ways.
It's like a really exciting time. When I started my scientific career and I went to conferences, I would go to vasculature conferences, specific conferences for vasculature, and it would be mostly heart disease people. Then I would go to neuroscience conferences and it would be mostly neurology people. So there was like never really a space for these interdisciplinary folks. And that is getting way better. And I think that should continue so that we optimize the way we are trying to tackle diseases, how we tackle all of those different aspects, how to treat diseases. So many different fields have added knowledge, and we will be able to connect those and we'll really thrive on that basis.
There's clearly momentum, not only in the research itself, but the way that scientists like you talk about these efforts. There's still so much we may not know, but the passion is so clearly there. What keeps you going? What motivates you to keep pushing through the challenges and the setbacks?
When you start your scientific career, you don't want to fail. But I think as I grew in my career, I just learned that actually failure teaches you a lot, more so than successes sometimes. If you do something and you're successful the first time, you don't really know why it worked. I think it is important to just always stay open for learning. I always tell my team that as long as we are learning something, we are good. You need frustration tolerance in science in general, but it is great to work together with a team that is not afraid to tackle these complexities, or to work in a community that is not afraid to tackle those complexities, but really takes them as they are and try to not take them as hurdles and problems, but as opportunities.
When you work in discovery and research, to get something to the point at which it's actually commercial and is available broadly, So much of what we work on just doesn't get there. We don't get those very often. They're few and far between, and you're spending decades of your life. You spend all this time in school, you spend all this time working with some of the smartest people in the world, and it does take a long time, and a lot of what you're working on just doesn't get there. But that's okay. That's okay. That's what we have to do.
That's part of being a scientist. You're going to experience way more failures in your career than successes, especially when we're talking about research and development of pharmaceuticals, because as you said, I mean, it takes decades.
Well, in part is, I'm surrounded with a bunch of just super smart people, a lot smarter than me. And
I don't know about that, but
No, trust me. I have the dream team here. It's just, they're incredible. And they motivate me. Their scientific curiosity, their drive, their desire to come up with something new that it's going to help people. And then our patients motivate me too. Then we think about some of the biggest challenges we face, such as cancer and oncology, such as Alzheimer's disease. Oh my gosh, if we can make this impact there, it's going to be tremendous. This research has been studied for many, many years, and only recently have we started to see some of this break through, some of the early clinical results that suggest, yes, it's actually going to be more effective. We're really excited about this, and so I know how important this is, and so we have to come up with a better way and be persistent and keep trying to figure out how we can tip that balance to really maximize the reward and minimize the risk. How can we make it the best? How can we make this available to more people, make it more convenient, make it safer, and really see the potential of a treatment that could transform people's lives? And so that is the ultimate objective.
It's clear that persistence is woven into everything you and your team do. So I'd love to hear, what does persistence look like to you?
Persistence looks like hope. Hope that we can make a difference. And hope is incredibly powerful. It's that hope of helping people, changing their lives. It's science with a purpose. That is our mission, is to bring that to patients. And we hope that we can transform their lives. And that's the motivating factor for us.
The blood-brain barrier is both a guardian and a selective gatekeeper, protecting the brain while continuing to pose one of medicine's greatest challenges. The science is, as always, complex. The roadblocks are real. But step by step, researchers are learning how to navigate this fortress, opening exciting new possibilities for future research. It's not easy work, but as we've heard, the persistence is starting to pay off. And I, for one, can't wait to see what happens next. Thanks for joining us in the Persistence Lab. If today's conversation gave you something to think about, we'd love for you to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about where science is headed. Don't forget to leave a rating and review. It helps others discover the work happening behind the scenes. We'll meet you back here next time with another story that will bring you a little closer to the people pushing medicine forward.